West had been back in the city for exactly 1 week, 7 days, yet every single moment felt like he was still 1,000 miles away, trapped in a liminal space between two incompatible worlds, one ruled by the unrelenting chaos of war, and the other masquerading as peace. The peace that civilians spoke of with such certainty felt like an illusion, a hollow dream of what peace should be, but not what it truly was. The city's pulse, its ceaseless hum of noise and movement reminded him too much of the battlefield. It wasn't a place of solace. It was a pressure cooker, hissing with barely contained violence. The shouting of street vendors, the jarring blast of car horns, the hurried shuffles of countless feet, all of it hit him like a grenade blast. Overwhelming, disorienting. His senses, sharpened from years of military discipline, remained on high alert. Every sound, every movement was magnified and catalogued as a potential threat. He couldn't turn it off. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed felt like it was hiding something, a battlefield in disguise. His instincts screamed at him, a constant background noise in his mind. The war might have been over for him, but his body hadn't gotten the memo. It wasn't safe. It never felt safe. The city, with all its promises of opportunity and rebirth, was as much a jungle as the war zones he'd left behind. There were no mortar shells here, no sniper scopes glinting in the sun, but the predators were still present. Different uniforms, different weapons, but predators all the same. West kept his head low as he moved through them. Streets, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He wasn't here for trouble. Not today. He'd been trying desperately to keep himself grounded. A cup of coffee, a quiet corner, a moment to feel human again. It wasn't much to ask. The cool city air bit at his fingers as he stepped out of the corner cafe. He cradled the warm paper cup between his hands, his eyes scanning the crowded sidewalks as people passed by in a blur of muted colors and hurried conversations. It was a moving tapestry of lives he couldn't quite connect to anymore. That's when he heard it, the distant growl of engines. At first, it blended with the usual city noise, a background hum. But then it grew louder, more distinct. There was an aggression to it, a rhythm that set his teeth on edge. His grip on the coffee cup tightened as the sound reverberated through the air, deep and guttural, like a pack of wolves on the hunt. A dozen, maybe more. The pack appeared at the far end of the street, their chrome glinting under the midday sun. They surged forward, slicing through traffic like predators through a herd, scattering pedestrians and cars alike. Their engines roared in unison, drowning out the city's natural cacophony. West's hand twitched instinctively. Toward his side, his fingers brushing the empty space where his holster used to rest. His pulse quickened as he scanned the scene, his brain already calculating the odds. This wasn't a casual ride. These men weren't just passing through. They were making a statement, and they weren't alone. At the front of the pack rode their leader, a towering figure on a black Harley with flames painted across its sides. His shaved head gleamed in the sunlight, but it was the tattoo on his neck that caught West's attention, a grinning skull wreathed in smoke. It wasn't just ink, it was a declaration, a brand. The leader slowed his bike as he reached the crosswalk, his cold eyes sweeping over the crowd, like a predator choosing its prey. When his gaze landed on West, something shifted. It was as if he could sense the quiet strength in the man standing there, the calm in his stance that spoke of battles fought and survived. He revved his engine, the sound slicing through the tense silence. The leader's sneer widened as he maneuvered his bike directly in front of West, cutting off the path. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and burning rubber. The leader dismounted, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate weight. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath as he approached, his eyes locked on West. "You've got guts, soldier," he said, his voice low and dripping with disdain. "Standing there like you own the place." West didn't respond. His posture remained steady, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't here to start a fight, but he'd finish one if he had to. The leader took another step closer, his grin turning sharp and predatory. "What's that matter? Cat got your tongue?" He glanced over his shoulder at his gang, who laughed on cue, their voices a chorus of menace. West's voice was calm when he finally spoke. "Move your bike." The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, wider and more menacing. "Oh, you think you can just order me around? You don't know who you're dealing with." He raised his fist, but West was already moving. In a blur of motion, West sidestepped the attack, his hand catching the leader's wrist and twisting it sharply. The man let out a pained grunt as West used his own momentum to throw him off balance, sending him crashing into the side of a parked car. The crowd gasped, their fear mingling with awe. The rest of the gang surged forward, their movements uncoordinated but full of brute force. West didn't wait for them to strike. He ducked under a swinging chain, grabbing the wielder's arm and slamming his elbow into the man's ribs. Another biker lunged with a knife, but West disarmed him in seconds, sending the blade skittering across the pavement. Each movement was precise, efficient. West wasn't fighting to win, he was fighting to neutralize, to survive. By the time the dust settled, the gang was in shambles. Some of them were on the ground, groaning in pain. Others had retreated to their bikes, their confidence shaken. The leader pulled himself to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. West stepped forward, his presence radiating quiet authority. "It is for now." The leader glared at him for a long moment before backing away, motioning for his gang to follow. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a stunned silence. West exhaled slowly, his muscles still taut with adrenaline. The crowd began to disperse, some throwing him grateful glances, others keeping their distance. As he turned to leave, familiar voice called out to him, "West." He turned to see Elena standing at the edge of the sidewalk, her expression a mix of concern and something else, something deeper. "You okay?" she asked, stepping closer. West gave a small nod. Yeah, but in his gut, he knew this was far from over. The roar of the motorcycles had long faded, but West's mind was still loud with them, echoes of what had just unfolded. The fight had ended, but something far more dangerous was beginning to unravel. He didn't know what it was yet, but it gnawed at him, a quiet, insistent warning. His eyes followed the retreating crowd until only one figure remained. Elena. She wasn't a stranger, though she often felt like one. They'd met years ago, before the uniform had defined his life, before war had stolen the light from his eyes. She'd been a reporter back then, brilliant, relentless, and entirely unafraid of getting too close to danger. Elena had a way of pulling stories out of people, even when they didn't want to tell them. And now, she stood before him, her dark eyes sharp and searching, like she was trying to read him all over again. "Still fighting other people's battles, I see," she said, crossing her arms. Her voice carried that same blend of warmth and steel he remembered. West's jaw tightened. "That wasn't my battle. It just landed at my feet." Elena tilted her head, unconvinced. Funny how trouble always seems to find you. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. That wasn't random, West. Those guys, they weren't just out for a joyride, I figured, West said, his tone flat. They're marking territory, sending a message. No, Elena said sharply, her eyes narrowing. It was more than that. The guy you put on his back, that's Anton Greaves. He's not just some biker. He's the leader of the Skull Kings. West frowned. He'd heard the name before, whispered in the darker corners of the city. The Skull Kings weren't just a gang, they were a force of nature. Drugs, weapons, extortion, they had their hands in everything. And now he'd made himself a target, far from the busy streets, in a dimly lit garage on the outskirts of the city. Anton Greaves nursed his bruised ego and cracked ribs. The gang leader sat slumped in an old chair, surrounded by his lieutenants. The air was thick with smoke and tension. Who the hell is this guy? One of them snarled, pacing back and forth. Anton's expression darkened as he lit a cigarette. A soldier. You can see it in the way he moves. What's he doing here? That's what we need to find out, Anton said, his voice cold. Nobody walks into my city and makes me look like a fool. A man in a tailored suit stepped out of the shadows. He didn't belong here, not with his polished shoes and air of quiet menace. His name was Vargas, a name whispered in connection to things no one dared to talk about too loudly. If Anton was a king, Vargas was the power behind the throne. You're lucky he didn't kill you, Vargas said, his tone sharp. Anton bristled. I don't need your input, you need a plan, Vargas interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. That man is dangerous, and if he's here, it's not by accident. Do some digging. Find out why. West didn't go back to his apartment right away. He walked the streets instead, blending into the shadows like a ghost. His steps were deliberate, his mind replaying the events of the day. He knew the Skull Kings wouldn't let this go. Gangs never did. A man like Anton couldn't afford to lose face without retaliating. It wasn't about the fight anymore, it was about power. The thought didn't scare him. What bothered him was the look in Elena's eyes when she said the fight wasn't random. She knew more than she was letting on. He found himself outside her office, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the night. She worked out of a small newsroom, a holdout, against the big corporate media outlets. Wes knew she wouldn't be here much longer. Elena was always chasing the next big story. The door was unlocked, and he stepped inside. You never knock, Elena said without looking up from her desk. You always leave the door open, Wes countered. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. You're predictable. That's a weakness, you know. West ignored the jab. What aren't you telling me? Elena hesitated, her fingers drumming against the desk. The Skull Kings have been expanding. They've moved from the outer boroughs into the heart of the city. Someone's been funding them, arming them. It's not just a turf war anymore, it's organized. West crossed his arms, his expression hardening. And you just embarrassed. Their leader in broad daylight, she said, which means they're going to come after you, and maybe anyone close to you. Her words hit harder than he expected. I can handle myself, he said. I'm not worried about you, Elena shot back. I'm worried about the people who get caught in the crossfire. West stepped closer, lowering his voice. Why are you really telling me this? You could have stayed out of it. Elena's gaze softened, just for a moment. Because I know you, West. You won't back down. And if you're going to take this on, You need to know what you're up against. Anton Greaves wasn't the only one with eyes on. West, far from the city, in a nondescript office lit by the glow of computer monitors, a man watched the footage of the street fight on loop. His name was Agent James Holt, and he was no stranger to violence. A high-ranking operative in a government agency that didn't officially exist, Holt had been tracking the Skull Kings for months. "This guy's a problem," one of his analysts said, pausing the video on West's face. "No," Holt replied, a small smile tugging at it. His lips. "He's a solution." The analyst frowned. "You think he can take them down?" Holt leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I think he already has their attention. And now, we just have to see what he does next." The city's underworld was a powder keg, and West had just lit the fuse. As the Skull Kings plotted their revenge and Elena uncovered dangerous truths, West found himself at the center of a conflict he couldn't walk away from. But he wasn't alone. Elena's knowledge, Holt's mysterious agenda, and the Skull King's growing power were all pieces of a larger puzzle. And as West prepared for the inevitable storm, one question burned in his mind: who was pulling the strings?